Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Ada.
Well, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the second edition of your book, Inequality in America.
Great, I'm happy to.
We're obviously super proud to
Thank
publish
you.
it. It's a great book. First edition did wonderfully. And so you're writing a second edition.
Writing a second edition. It's been a lot of work, but it's an important time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that it'll be coming out in July 2017.
Time for fall classes.
Time for fall classes, that's right. Because I have a feeling it's a subject that will come up in quite a few classrooms this year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm already getting that kind of questions from folks about whether or not there's going to be a new edition, or whether or not, in what ways have people used it in class, because folks who maybe historically have not focused on inequality as part of what they do in the classroom are increasingly thinking that it's something students need to understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before they leave college.
So let's go back a little bit. What made you want to write this book in the first place?
It was a tremendous challenge to figure out how to, in a succinct way, make the case for the complexity of inequality. I think, through most of my life, I've heard explanations about economic and racial inequality that centered on interpersonal kind of questions. People not working hard enough, people not trying hard, a culture of dependency, and those types of things. And as I began to realize how complicated this issue was, that it was not nearly as simple as that. In fact, it had very little to do with those things. I had thought for a while about how can I convey that, how can I help students understand that. And I tried to do that for a long time in my classes, and I still try to do that in my classes. And so when the opportunity presented to try to put pen to paper and make sense of that in a way that would be accessible to other folks, I thought we should give it a try.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was the most, interesting thing to you about sort of revisiting the subject in a second edition?
Well, one of the things that has been interesting the whole way through is the degree to which people who identify as conservative, economically conservative, are also interested in issues of inequality. They're not always for the same reasons as people who identify as progressive, but they care. Lots of them do, and I try to get examples throughout the book, not because I was aiming for any particular balance. I don't think that's my responsibility to do as a scholar, but I do think it's important for students to understand that irrespective of their own value system or where they might be politically, that issues of inequality are seen as troubling for a variety of reasons, and that understanding the complexity of that will be beneficial to them. So I have to say that there's not a lot of attention paid to conservatives who are addressing these issues, and it's partly because of the political expediency to downplay them, and for conservatives sometimes to focus on those interpersonal qualities. But for a lot of the folks who are doing it, they understand that there are systemic elements to this, and that capitalism to some extent can be compromised by too much inequality, and in fact democracy can be compromised by too much inequality.
That's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of people think about inequality as just a progressive issue.
Right, and it has been disproportionately that, and certainly visibly that, and progressives frame it as a moral imperative or an ethical imperative to alleviate inequality, and I certainly appreciate that. Conservatives sometimes do as well. Some conservatives frame it as a moral or ethical issue, but they often are concerned about the economic realities of growing inequality or inequality that gets to a certain point that makes it difficult for capitalism to function effectively as well.
Sure, yeah. So what did you find most difficult about working on the second edition?
It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I have to be honest, because in the first edition, again, you open up a blank Word document, right? Chapter 1, and you have to start from scratch and map out exactly where it was to be. This was hard because I was very mindful of the size of the book. I didn't want it to grow too big. First of all, because it would be difficult for instructors to assign it in the ways they have previously. This series is devoted to being thorough but being concise at the same time, because a lot of these books are used as companion texts and not sole texts in the course, and so I wanted to respect that, and also I wanted to be mindful of price. I wanted to make sure that the book didn't get so expensive. There seems a tremendous amount of irony in having a book about inequality that students can't afford, and so it was hard for me to figure out where. It wasn't hard to know where to update. It was clear what data were dated and that needed to be updated, or when new examples came about that I thought would resonate more powerfully. I certainly could change those things out. But there were other places where I think we needed to do some more substantive work in the area of criminal justice and immigration, in particular, those two areas. And so one of the things that we did was split out the chapter that in the first edition was combined with crime and employment, which had a small immigration section. We now have a standalone chapter on criminal justice. Michael Brown was killed just months after the first edition was published, and Black Lives Matter was launched shortly thereafter. And so there was much more to talk about, much more public attention being paid to police brutality and accusations of implicit bias on the part of police officers that really needed the attention of a full chapter. And so we expanded that out to a full chapter, spent a little more time on immigration on the chapter about employment. But at the same time, again, adding a chapter, you worry about the book getting too big.
Sure.
So finding places to cut that wasn't going to undermine what was successful in the first edition was challenging.
It's probably most challenging for every author that I've worked with. And I would probably say that the addition of the new criminal justice chapter is one of my favorite things about the new edition. Do you have a favorite?
I think me too, only because I'm proud of it. I think I captured the dynamic as well as I could, keeping in mind that people weren't going to be reading it when I was writing it.
Sure.
I think, going back to your last question about challenge, I wasn't writing a blog entry. I mean, I had to write it in a way that would hold up.
Sure.
And not be, I'm writing in a particular moment in time, in a very politically challenging moment in time on all sides. There's a lot of passions as a result of the election and those types of things.
Right.
But I had to remember that that's not when people were going to read it. I had to write it for when people would read it, not write it for when I was writing it, and that became difficult as well.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. It's always a challenge when writing a textbook to, or a book used for college courses, to sort of keep it broad and appealing enough and useful enough for a classroom at any point in time.
That's right.
But since you bring up, the current point,
That's right.
post 2016 election.
Literally writing this edition as it's unfolding.
Right.
There was a moment where I was putting finishing touches on a chapter as the inauguration was on the television behind me. I mean, it was a really powerful significance
I
of
bet.
that.
And even as your editor working on it, reading the chapters as this was all unfolding, it was challenging at times, but also very interesting and powerful, I think, to have your book help me work out some of what I was feeling about the election.
I'm glad. I hope that translates to students too.
I'm sure it will.
Other folks should read it. I'll tell you that one of the things that I was proudest of in the first edition that many people commented on is that I didn't ignore rural poverty or white poverty. Poverty tends to be disproportionately black and brown because it's statistically so, but it also tends to be that way because there's concentration in big cities, which is where media markets are.
Sure.
And so rural poverty becomes invisible. But so many college students around the country are coming from very small towns, impoverished towns, or even impoverished families, but certainly in areas that they saw a plant close when they were little and see what happens in the town as a result of that. And as we know that a lot of President Trump's attention had been focused on those types of areas, and because of the way the Electoral College is structured, his strength in the states that had big rural areas were able to help capture the presidency, even as he lost the popular vote by 2.8 million.
Right.
And so I was proud that we already had that base in place, and the current election cycle allowed me some space to leverage that to even more fully discuss what it means to be white and poor in rural America. And so I hope I was able to capture that dynamic in a little in its full richness in the second edition, and even in a way that wasn't available to me in the first edition.
Sure. Yeah.